Welcome to the timeline of Phoenix Suns channel. My name is Mike and I'm here with Sam. And for today's one big question, we're talking about whether or not the Suns deserve to have a player in the MVP conversation. Here we go. All right, Sam, before we get into whether or not there's a specific Suns player that deserves to be in the MVP conversation, I just want to talk about whether or not we think the Suns as a team deserve to have even one player in that conversation. It's an interesting year. The Suns have two really, really good players, but they play as a team. They play together. But they do have a top 2 record in the NBA, and generally that means that they kind of deserve to have a player in that conversation. I think there's no case to be made that they have a player that deserves to win, so we can kind of throw that out entirely just because there's players like Nikola Jokic that are doing incredible things statistically this year. But I think it's fair to think that they could have at least one player in that conversation, maybe top 5 in voting if you really look at it that way. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't mind if there's going to be any member of the media who wants to throw some votes to a Suns player, whether that be Devin Booker or Chris Paul. As you said, this team, their record is just going to be so good at the end of the season. But like arguing for them to be higher than, say, top 5, kind of just a guy you might throw a 4th or 5th place vote to, I think it's also okay for us sometimes to just admit when a team is really good because of the sum of its parts, because of all of the role players playing to their collective roles. And as I look up and down this Suns roster that we've currently assembled, honestly, what it reminds me a lot of is if you go back to the last time the Suns made the playoffs, the 2009-2010 Suns team that went to the Western Conference Finals. You look back at that team, you had a guy like Steve Nash, who was no longer MVP Steve Nash, but he was still 35-year-old Steve Nash. He was doing his thing. You had Amari Stoudemire, still an all-star, but ultimately you just had a really deep team comprised of really well-fitting pieces. And as I look at the Suns and what they're currently doing this year, I think it's okay for us to admit that that's more or less what's going on this year. Devin Booker has had a really good year. Chris Paul has had a really good year. We can debate in a bit who's been better, but the role players, and this is credit to James Jones, who we talked about last week, have just played so well, and that's really what's made this a collective great team unit. And I think that should be rewarded more than any individual player for MVP.
Yeah, the MVP award in general, I commonly talk about, it's a narrative-based award anyway. Like, a lot of it has to do with the story that's being told about the team, which just sort of, it makes everything matter a little bit less as far as how the team's playing. But the Suns do have an interesting narrative in that last year they didn't make the playoffs. They added a player, and now they're at the top of the standings. Potentially could be the number 1 seed by the end of the year. But I agree with you. I think the way the team plays, we made this comparison on our podcast recently. You know, Monty Williams technically came from the Spurs. He worked with Greg Popovich in the past, and they do kind of play like Spurs teams of old. Yeah. Lots of assists, lots of moving the ball movement in general. They have that 0.5 system that they call it, which is as soon as you catch the ball, you either pass, drive, or shoot. And that comes from that Greg Popovich style of coaching. And, you know, they did have MVPs in their time at the Spurs when they were dominant, but a lot of times when they were really good, they were never really part of that MVP narrative. But I think just looking at the Suns, that it'd be surprising if they didn't have a player in the MVP narrative at the end of the season if they finish as a top 2 seed in the West. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think ultimately, you know, most of the time when people bring up this conversation, it's does Chris Paul deserve to be there in the conversation, as in, is he a top 5 or top 10 candidate, or Devin Booker? You know, they're not really talking about competing with Nikola Jokic per se, because Jokic is averaging 27, 10, and 10, and it's, you know, it's just more unlikely that they'd really be able to steal something from one of those guys, regardless of the narratives.
I think where the conversation gets really interesting is whether or not who you pick, really. Who do you think would be the MVP if somebody were to vote on the Suns? And I think commonly what people who vote on the MVP do is they just kind of pick their favorite advanced statistic and then just vote for the guy that's at the top of that specific advanced statistic as long as they're on a winning team, whether that be Luka Doncic, Nikola Jokic, Joel Embiid. You know, they just pick their favorite statistic. And I was looking down at the Suns at specific advanced statistics here. For example, VORP, Chris Paul is top of the team in VORP. Raptor, Devin Booker, WAR, wins above replacements. Devin Booker Estimated plus minus, which is a commonly used statistic now, that's DeAndre Ayton, number one on the Suns.
I don't think he's getting any votes, but that is an interesting one.
Yeah, exactly. Real plus minus is Chris Paul, which is then followed by Jay Crowder. Like, it's not even Devin Booker in that stat. And you look at these advanced statistics, and even this paints a picture of a team that makes it difficult to decide who would be the MVP, assuming the Suns are at the top of the standings and deserve someone to vote for. And in a way, you can look at this as these two guys are likely going to split votes. Maybe they won't even have a guy in the top 5 because of that. Chris Paul has the narrative. I personally think that Devin Booker is more important to the team's success overall. But what do you think?
Yeah, it goes back to that narrative. You know, I'm tempted to agree with you about Devin Booker. Obviously, he scores more points. He does more for the gravity within the flow of the offense. But at the end of the day, it's all about narratives and not always, frankly, with facts when it comes to MVP voting. So, you know, you go back a decade. In 2011-2012, Chris Paul finished third in MVP voting after only LeBron and KD. He averaged about 20 points and 9 assists per game that season, but actually he played much more than he does currently, Mike. So if you go and you compare that season to this one on a per 36 basis, you'll find that the stats in those two seasons, Chris Paul at 35 versus Chris Paul at 27 with the Clippers, the stats are very similar. So the point is, Chris Paul that year didn't shoot his way top 3 into the MVP conversation because of his per game stats. There were always guys along his career who scored more points than he did. But he got into the MVP conversation that year because he took the Clippers from 32 wins to a 50-win pace. It was his first year in LA. And so he had the narrative going for him. And I think, 10 years, the league operates mostly when we talk about these awards in exactly the same way. If you're asking that the national media who vote on this award be able to separate Chris Paul's arrival from the overall surge that this team has had, then I think, unfortunately, you're just kind of asking too much from guys who didn't pay a lick of attention to the Suns until this season, So I think you already made the advanced stats argument. I was going to kind of get into some of those. Like, technically, the advanced stats, probably a couple more of them favor Chris Paul over Devin Booker. But overall, the most potent argument for it being Paul is just he's got the narrative. The Suns are winning more games, and we've already seen in the way the media talks about him that they're going to reward that.
Yeah, I think with Chris Paul, he just makes no mistakes, and that means that advanced stats kind of do favor him in a lot of ways because he makes no mistakes. But as far as the importance for actual wins, you need like an absolute offensive fulcrum where they can't be single covered. Essentially, Devin Booker's a guy who can't be single covered unless it's by one of the top defenders in the NBA. If you look at the on-off stats too, it's kind of interesting. The Suns are actually better when Chris Paul is off the court and Devin Booker is on the court than vice versa, where Devin Booker is off the court and Chris Paul is on the court. These stats were taken, by the way, morning of April 13th. Just the raw plus minus alone, it's plus 54 with Devin Booker on the court and Chris Paul off the court versus plus 27 with Chris Paul on the court and Devin Booker off. And then in the net rating, it's actually pretty similar, where it's plus 10 with Devin Booker on and just plus 9 with just Chris Paul on. So if you just look at the raw stats alone, it looks like Devin Booker has a bigger impact on the Suns playing well. My personal thought, just by looking at the game just from an eye test perspective, it matters more too because he's just so many defensive players are just drawn to him defensively, and that opens so many more guys up. Now, this is a funny conversation to have because you're comparing two Suns players to each other. But I think that commonly, just like you said, people are going to vote for Chris Paul because he's the new guy on the team. In fact, you look at the last MVP that the Suns won, it was Steve Nash joining a team and them having this dramatic uptick in wins. That was a lot more obvious of a case to make. But when I think about it, I think that you're right. It's commonly they're going to look at Chris Paul. I just want to shed a little light on how good Devin Booker is and how important he is to this team. And I hope that voters try to at least reward him for that, because I think, like I said, they commonly just pick their favorite advanced statistic and vote for the guy that's at the top of that. So personally, I just want to give Devin Booker a little love. I think he's more important to the success of this team in general. Not that Chris Paul is not important. It's just the impact that offensive superstars like that have on the team is just massive, massive.
Yeah, and as we wrap up here, I think Suns fans are going to be very energetic in their own campaigns for getting these guys to, all defensive teams, all NBA teams. I don't think anything else is off the table for rewarding this team for the collective group effort and just the fantastic season that they've all had. MVP is maybe that one award that's just going to be out of reach for them. But obviously Booker and Chris Paul, I think we can agree, have both been just fantastic.
So I guess we settled on Chris Paul is more likely to receive votes, but you can make a case for either one of these guys to receive votes. Obviously, this is something that we're going to keep track of. Subscribe to our channel. We'll update you with more information about this. Don't forget to look for our podcast, The Timeline of Phoenix Suns Podcast. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.